The night before my sister's wedding rehearsal, she looked at me in the mirror and smiled like she was handing me a gift. "You should really take some space from the family for a while," she said. So I did. I sold the cabin she thought was already hers. And 3 days later, I placed a white envelope at every single table at her reception. What was inside those envelopes would follow her for the rest of her life. But before I tell you what I put in them, you need to understand what I'd already given her and what she'd quietly been doing with it for years. My name is Delaney Whitfield. Everyone calls me Lane. I'm 31 years old. And until last spring, I believed that loving someone meant absorbing whatever they threw at you and calling it loyalty. I don't believe that anymore. Sister's name is Camille. She's 4 years older than me. And for most of our lives, she was the closest thing to a mother I had left. Our parents died when I was 16. A drunk driver crossed the median on a rainy October night outside Charlotte, North Carolina, and took both of them in the same instant. I remember standing in the hallway of Mercy General while a police officer tried to explain something my brain refused to process. Camille arrived 20 minutes later, soaked from the rain, and pulled me into her coat before either of us said a word. She was 20 years old. Everyone said she was a rock. The aunts, the neighbors, our old pastor, they praised her endlessly. Camille is holding that family together. Camille is so strong. She wore that praise like a crown. And for years, I thought the crown was earned. It took me a long time to understand that Camille didn't just accept that attention. She needed it, the way some people need a substance. And somewhere along the way, I became the quiet supply line that kept her comfortable while she performed strength for everyone else. I finished high school. I got a partial scholarship to UNC Charlotte. I studied information systems, graduated with honors, and built a career as a business operations manager at a logistics firm downtown. I paid off my own student loans in 6 years. I kept my apartment tidy, my savings steady, and my ambitions quiet. Because I'd learned early that being loud about your own life invited resentment from people who expected you to make room for theirs. Camille, meanwhile, needed things. Never in a dramatic way. She was too proud for that. It was always small. A few $100s here because a check hadn't cleared. A deposit there because a landlord was being unreasonable. A favor that started as temporary and somehow never ended. When I was 27, I found the keys. They were in a shoebox under my old bed, which I was finally clearing out after our aunt sold the family house. A small brass key ring with a laminated tag in my mother's handwriting that read Times Asheville. I hadn't known it existed, a modest one-bedroom condo in the mountains. Something my mother had bought quietly years before she died, with outdated carpet and a kitchen that hadn't been touched since the 90s. Nobody had claimed it. Nobody had even remembered it. I didn't take it to sell it. I took it because it still smelled faintly like her, in the way old houses hold on to the people who loved them. I wasn't ready to let that go. Over the next 2 years, I rebuilt it on weekends. I tore up the carpet with my own hands and found good oak floors underneath. I refinished them myself over 3 exhausting Saturdays. I repainted every wall in colors my mother used to love: soft sage, warm cream. I installed a new tile backsplash in the kitchen, cutting each piece on a rented wet saw in the driveway, terrified I'd ruin the pattern. I did it because I wanted there to be one place left in the world that still felt like her. Somewhere Camille and I could walk into and feel held. The first time I brought Camille there, she stood in the doorway with her hand pressed over her mouth. She turned and hugged me so hard I felt my ribs compress. She said, "Nobody has ever loved me the way you do." I gave her the keys. I told her it was hers. She said it would be a place we could both heal in. She meant it. I think for about a year. Then Preston showed up. Preston Marsh was the kind of man who never stopped auditioning for a room. 36 years old. Always tan. Always dressed like he'd just stepped out of a menswear catalog. He had a laugh that arrived half a second too fast. A habit of finishing your sentences before you did. And eyes that swept a room like he was pricing everything in it. Camille fell for him the way she fell for everything completely. Immediately. Without checking the landing first. I wanted to be happy for her. I tried. The small changes started almost right away. He began joining our phone calls. His voice sliding into conversations that used to belong just to the two of us. Camille stopped mentioning her therapy sessions. She started canceling plans to avoid restaurants Preston doesn't love. She asked me not to bring up my promotion at work in front of him because he was in a sensitive place about his own career. I swallowed all of it. I told myself, this was just what happens when someone falls in love. You make room. You adjust. You give the new relationship space to breathe. Then she started asking about money. Never large amounts. Always reasonable sounding. A deposit that needed to clear before a vendor's deadline. A gap between paychecks. A joint account that was briefly frozen during a bank transfer. I gave her what she asked. Twice. Then 3 times. Then a 4th. Once. I mentioned how expensive weddings had gotten these days. Her voice went flat. And she changed the subject so fast it left a ring in my ears. I told myself it was wedding stress. I had gotten very good at telling myself things. I drove straight from work to her house on a Thursday afternoon in late September, still in my blazer, telling myself it would be one last quiet sister moment before everything shifted. She was in her guest room, half in her wedding gown, hair pinned into a loose updo, looking at herself in a tall mirror, the way brides do, measuring themselves against some future version they haven't met yet. I knelt without thinking to straighten the hem where it had bunched near the floor. 16 years of habit. 16 years of smoothing things out for her. That's when she said it, looking at me in the mirror instead of turning around. Honestly, lame. The best gift you could give me for the wedding is some space from the family. Just for a while. She said it brightly, almost sweetly, like she was doing me a favor by telling me. She said I brought old grief energy into things that were supposed to be joyful. That it was her time to build a life that didn't feel tied to obligation. Obligation. I was still kneeling when she said that word. I thought about the condo. About 2 years of weekends on my knees on different floors for different reasons. About what she'd said when I gave her the keys. Preston appeared in the doorway behind her. One shoulder against the frame. The posture of a man who has already decided he owns whatever room he's standing in. Don't take it personally, he said gently. Big life events bring up old tensions. You tend to misread situations. He said it the way people talk to someone they've already decided to correct without the discomfort of an actual argument. I stood up slowly, smoothed my jacket, looked at my sister, really looked at her and said quietly that I didn't understand. She laughed, not warmly, like my confusion was faintly ridiculous. Then she said if I truly loved her, I would give her that one gift and step back. I left without slamming the door. For the first time in my life, I chose silence over apology. Outside, the September light was dropping gold behind the rooftops. My chest felt hollow, but my hands were steady. That surprised me. I stood by my car and let the hurt settle into something else entirely, something that stopped feeling like pain and started feeling like information. Number, the email I almost deleted. I got home just before 9, still in my work clothes, and opened my laptop out of habit. A notification blinked at the top of my inbox, a routine annual property summary from my attorney's office. I almost deleted it without reading it. I didn't. The Asheville condo was listed under my name. Sole owner. Never transferred. Never made joint. Exactly as it had been since my mother's estate closed. I had handed Camille a set of keys and called it hers. I had never filed a single piece of paperwork to make that true. Under North Carolina law, the property was still entirely mine. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone and called a man I hadn't spoken to in 2 years, Frank Dobbins, a private investigator based in Charlotte. 54, former state fraud examiner. The kind of unremarkable-looking man you'd overlook in any crowded room, which is exactly why he was so good at his job. I'd worked with him once, years earlier, during an internal fraud case at my company. He answered on the third ring. I told him everything, Preston. The pattern of requests, the property summary glowing on my screen. He listened without interrupting. And when I finished, he said he could run a preliminary background check overnight. We agreed to meet the next morning. Frank was already seated when I arrived, a manila folder beside his coffee. He waited until I'd ordered before he opened it. Preston Marsh. It turned out was not always Preston Marsh. Over the past decade, he had operated under 2 different surnames across 3 states, attached to a trail of addresses, small claims filings, and at least 2 formal fraud complaints. In Georgia, a woman named Diane Sutter, 56, had filed against a man matching his description for borrowing a significant sum toward a startup investment that never existed. He vanished before the case could proceed. In Kentucky, a man named Nathaniel Cole had reported a nearly identical scheme borrowed savings, promised returns, a sudden disappearance. Then Frank pushed a 3rd page toward me. My name was on it. So was Cammie's. There were no liens on the condo yet. But there was something worse, a draft loan application at a regional bank. Incomplete, but very much begun, in which Preston had listed the Asheville condo as collateral for a renovation loan. My name sat in the property owner field. Camille's name sat in the co-signer field. He had been trying to put my sister's name on debt secured by property that was never hers to offer. My throat went tight. I told Frank I'd never authorized any of it. He said he believed me. Then he said the thing that erased whatever doubt I had left. If your sister marries this man and signs anything, he hands her tomorrow. She becomes legally responsible for whatever he's already done and whatever he does next. Men like this don't stop. They just move on to the next version of the same con. He slid a small silver flash drive across the table. Everything was on it: the complaints, the public filings, the draft loan documents, and records on a woman named Kathy from Kentucky, whose name I'd overheard whispered at the rehearsal dinner the night before. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes after leaving that coffee shop, the folder on the passenger seat, doing math I'd been avoiding for months. Preston had already tried to leverage the condo once. The wedding was the next morning. Once the accounts merged and the paperwork was signed, everything Camille had, including whatever claims she believed she still had to, that condo would fold into a financial trap this man had clearly been building for years. The question wasn't whether to act. It was how. I called Miles Cutter, a property attorney I'd used twice before, and told him I wanted to list the condo for immediate sale. He asked if I was sure. I told him I had never been more certain of anything. He called back 40 minutes later with a cash offer from a developer he'd worked with previously. Fair market value. No contingencies. Ready to close within days. I authorized everything from my car, my hands steady on the screen. By the time I drove to the wedding venue in the mountains outside Asheville, the condo was no longer mine, and it would never, under any circumstance, belong to Preston Marsh. Frank spent that night turning the flash drive into something anyone could read in one sitting. No legal jargon. No dense reports. Just a clear, plain language summary of Preston's financial history, the Georgia complaint, the Kentucky complaint, named victims, named shell companies, named dates, and on the final page, a short paragraph describing the draft loan he'd attempted to secure against a condo that as of 2 days earlier no longer existed as an asset he could touch. We printed 94 copies, one for every place setting at the reception. The banquet coordinator was told 3 days in advance that they were favor envelopes from the couple. She didn't look closely. The ceremony was held at sunset beside a lake in the Blue Ridge foothills, the kind of view that costs extra for a reason. I sat through it. I watched Camille say her vows with tears sliding down her face, her hands trembling, her eyes lit with the kind of certainty I hadn't seen in her since before our parents died. It didn't feel like triumph. Watching that, it felt like grief, because I knew she genuinely believed this was the safest thing that had ever happened to her. The reception ballroom was exactly what she dreamed of: ivory linens, eucalyptus runners, candles floating in glass, floor-to-ceiling windows turning gold with the last of the light. On every table, small white envelopes sat perfectly centered, unassuming. Frank stood near the back in a dark suit, indistinguishable from the catering staff. 2 plainclothes detectives, Renata Alou and her partner Marcus Webb, both from the Mecklenburg County Financial Crimes Unit, sat near the bar with the relaxed posture of guests who had nowhere else to be. Diane Sutter had driven up from Georgia and sat quietly at table 9. Nathaniel Cole had flown in from Kentucky and sat at table 13, looking like a man who had waited a long time to be in the same room as his unfinished business. When Preston's eyes found mine across the room as the couple entered, the corner of his mouth lifted. He thought he'd won. He hadn't checked the tables. Dinner service began. The band played something soft. A flower girl fell asleep against her grandfather's shoulder. Everything looked exactly like a wedding is supposed to look. Then, at table 9, a chair scraped back. Diane stood up holding an open envelope, the page shaking in her hand. She didn't shout at first. She made a sound closer to a gasp, and then she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, that the man at the head table had taken her retirement savings under the promise of an investment that never existed and disappeared before she ever saw a cent returned. Preston laughed. An actual laugh. Short and incredulous, like a man who'd been through this exact scene before and knew precisely how to handle it. He started to say something about a misunderstanding, about bitter people, but by then the paper was tearing open at every table, one after another. The quietest kind of devastation I have ever witnessed. Confusion moved through the room like weather. Nathaniel stood next, holding his pages the way you hold evidence, not for drama, but to make sure everyone could see. He said he'd filed a complaint in Kentucky years earlier and been ignored. That he was still paying off debt Preston had left behind, while Preston smiled in new photos with a new woman. Preston was on his feet now, voice rising. All the charm gone, peeled away like wet paint. He called it an attack. He called it jealousy. And then his eyes found me across the room. And he pointed and said this was my doing, that I'd always been jealous of my sister, that I couldn't stand to watch her be happy. Every head in the room turned toward me. I didn't flinch. I'd spent my whole adult life afraid of exactly that moment, a room full of people looking at me with my sister's judgment reflected in their eyes. It felt like nothing at all. Detective Alou stood, identified herself and her unit, and said calmly that multiple formal complaints had been filed and reviewed, and that Preston Marsh was being detained pending a formal statement. He bolted for the side exit. He made it 3 strides before Detective Webb caught his arm near the edge of the dance floor. He struggled, swore, stumbled, and then the room watched a man in a fitted wedding suit get walked back through his own reception like something that had simply been postponed too long. Camille's chair toppled as she stood, calling his name, demanding he say something, anything that could hold the shape of the day she'd planned. He turned once, still fighting the detective's grip, and shouted that none of it was real, that these people were blaming him for their own failures. His eyes met mine one last time. He didn't say anything else worth remembering. Camille's knees buckled once he was gone. Her bouquet hit the floor, white peonies, chosen specifically because she'd read they symbolize new beginnings. A bridesmaid caught her before she went all the way down. Old instinct told me to cross the room and hold her together the way I always had. I stayed where I was. I had spent 16 years loving her by absorbing everything so she never had to feel the weight of it herself. It hadn't saved either of us. This time, I let the truth do the work I used to do myself. I drove home to Charlotte the next morning. The condo sale closed. Grainy phone footage from a guest ended up online within days. No names attached. Though everyone who needed to know eventually knew. Preston was formally charged 3 weeks later, and the stalled cases in Georgia and Kentucky were reopened under a single coordinated filing. Diane called me once just to say thank you, her voice thick with something close to relief. Nathaniel sent one text times he won't do this to anyone else. For Camille, the fraudulent credit applications Preston had rushed her to sign were placed under dispute. The bank's internal review, triggered partly by Frank's documentation of the failed loan attempt, flagged several accounts for misrepresentation. With help from a legal aid clinic and a financial counselor, most of the damaging obligations were eventually suspended or voided entirely. She wasn't unscathed, but she wasn't ruined. Either the one thing Preston had counted on most, the condo as leverage, the one asset that tied me permanently to whatever mess he built, was gone. Sold. Clean. Entirely out of his reach. He had planned to use the last warm piece of our mother against both of us. I didn't let him. 6 months later. It's a Saturday morning in Charlotte. 6 months on. I've moved into a small townhouse on a quiet street lined with maple trees, doing something extraordinary with the light. A cup of coffee is going lukewarm beside a journal open to a blank page. I found a therapist named Dr. Adaize Okafor, who specializes in family systems, and who has a small framed sign in her office that reads, "Time's clarity is not cruelty." I joined a Saturday hiking group full of people who have no idea about any of this and don't need to. I've slowly, carefully started seeing someone new. Nothing rushed. Nothing loud. Just something real. Camille and I talk every few days now, not the way we used to. With me functioning as her emotional shock absorber, but differently. With boundaries that hold like the frame of a well-built house. She told me once, sitting at my kitchen table a month after the wedding collapsed, that when everything fell apart, the first person she wanted to call was me, the same person she'd asked to disappear. I told her I knew. She asked how. I said, because I was still there that morning, with the journal open and the light moving slowly across the floor. I thought about kneeling on that dressing room carpet while she smiled at me in the mirror. And then I thought about the sound of paper tearing across a beautiful room. And a man being walked out through his own wedding by a detective who'd already reviewed the evidence and found it more than enough. I wrote one line, the only thing that felt completely true. She asked me to disappear from the family, so I disappeared from being the person who kept the family from seeing the truth. I closed the journal. Sunlight moved across the floor. A couple of kids on bikes blew past the window, laughing at something I couldn't hear through the glass. It was the most ordinary, quietly extraordinary morning I'd had in years. I hadn't disappeared from my family. I disappeared from being their excuse. And that was the only gift I ever needed to give myself.